So, a few questions for you guys. You are the founders of Inclusive Solutions. So, what is and who are Inclusive Solutions?
There's a question.
There's a question.
Derek and I founded it in the first instance. I think on the Isle of Wight ferry, wasn't it, Derek? Was the first conversation about it. I've been doing a lot of work on the Circle of Friends training, and I think Derek coined the phrase, "If we leave it too long, we'll be too old and knackered to do this." But that was over 20 years ago. We're still going strong, so it's all good. So we are. What are we? We're a small team. I mean, there's more than Derek and myself now. There are associates we work with. We've got a kind of a range of people who work with us. We've got disabled associates. We've got people from different backgrounds, different cultures. We've got some psychologists, some people with more of a teaching or head teacher background. We've got a range of people we can kind of draw upon now. And we have international associates we can sometimes involve as well. So basically it's a core team focused on what does it take to include all children in mainstream education, primary, secondary, FE, and then in thinking about the wider community, what does it take really? And we've always been fascinated in international ideas that can feed that, feed that sort of development, that we can feed people with, so they are best equipped to include all children and young people. And really, that's been our mission over those 20 years.
So I guess our longer background was as educational psychologists, but I think for me personally, even before we started Inclusive Solutions, you were always struggling to find ways of not having your mindset being a sort of medical model of what's wrong with this person. How do we fix it kind of mindset? And that'd be a constant thread for me of finding a script, a way of talking and thinking about difference that wasn't to do with pathologizing it and listing treatments. And when we first heard Jack Pierpoint and Marsha Forrest talk back in the mid-90s, that there seemed to be all kinds of ways forward, because nothing in their script was medical model at all, but it was quite radical, and they were very different sort of North American type trainers from ours. But suddenly people were standing up saying labels, get rid of them, and we had no idea how you do that or what that meant. It was such an appealing motif that there was no kind of looking back from there really. We went further and further down that road, somehow more attuned to things that were in that not medical model space. Don't think that covers quite how we do training, because I think you could do all the things I'm saying and still do a very kind of didactic bullet point training session. And I suppose what was also a bit unique about it was we tried to match our training style to what we were talking about. So if just listening to somebody droning on wasn't for you, then we were going to do it all kinds of different ways, like using a graphic and having lots of short video and snappy slides and all the things that made things hopefully more learnable, more teachable. So we've been very focused on teaching, haven't we, and what works, what's effective. We probably think more about training than anything else, don't we?
Yeah,
we're obsessed by what works in training, aren't we?
Totally. What can build empathy? What dramatic process can we bring in? What will really get people into the shoes of the children, the adults we're thinking about. Yeah, we're constantly reflecting on that, and
using props, even down to that.
Props, absolutely.
Fine detail of it. I mean, so often strikes people, isn't it, in the start of our days, that we're bringing out strange props and talking about them.
Yeah.
And
we didn't need much encouragement from Jack and Marsha from Inclusion Press way back to make us think, oh yeah, they've used those props, we could use these as well, and we bring some other stuff in and just brought it all into play. I mean,
beneath that, we're kind of saying, but this is good teaching. It's not just a gimmick for its own sake. If you bring out the squeaky duck or the judge's wig, fun as they might be, underneath that there's a belief that this is good teaching, that people The person who modelled the wig for us, if you ask them in 2 years' time what they remember from that training day, it's almost certainly to be the wig.
Yeah.
And that was the top bit. That's what stuck in their memories.
The power of participation.
And participation, absolutely fundamental. You can't just sit there silent for 6 hours.
So let me ask you guys, what is the most like popular training day that you provide, or what's the what's the most common work that you do, and who do you work with? What types of people do you work with?
I imagine the keys to inclusion. I think if you looked over the 20 years, we've probably spent the keys to inclusion half day or full day is probably our main one, because it's very much hearts and minds approach to the whole nature of including children and young people who might be different and challenging for whatever reason. But it's closely followed by creating circles of friends. You know, the whole idea of building a team from the peer group wrapped around the child. And of course, that was our first the first training we were doing together, really way back, and it was very, very popular at that time. We kind of opened it out and broadened it into a broader piece on inclusion, which seemed to go very well with people.
We were mainly asked to work with people in education, but in a way, the short answer is we'll work with who we're asked to work with. The times we've done keys to inclusion and whatever with people that have got no background in schools or education, it seems just as effective. It's the same issues. You've worked with sort of church elders and so on, haven't you, Colin?
Yeah, absolutely.
Groups that have no school basis.
Exactly. From as young as infants, we even once did a half day with a group of infant children who were like 5 and 6 year olds. That even they could access it in the same way that, you know, some erudite academics might also access exactly the same ideas. And we're kind of proud of that, really. That's exactly what we set out to do, really. To have something that was so accessible, literally anybody would be able to get into it, really. We've done a lot of work on behaviour as well, challenging behaviour, getting underneath behaviour, relationship kind of approaches, big on restorative justice, approaches like circular courage that kind of allow people to get right inside what might be going on for a person who others are finding challenging. Spent a lot of time on that, really. I suppose one of the reasons is that's a big, massive inclusion issue across the UK. You know, young people being excluded left, right, and centre, and of course also including and understanding autistic children and adults. And Derek had a very strong background in this, and you know, we were happy to share his passion on that, really, and develop that training. We've got some really good stuff there. Again, with a good international, quite unique perspective that people weren't used to encountering. So that's always gone down well.
Okay.
Well, we'd always been a bit uncertain when we've worked abroad at first, whether, you know, how the question we've asked ourselves is how well this is going to travel. If we suddenly pop up in Serbia or Athens with a non-English speaking audience and simultaneous translation going on, is it going to work? And you know, it's our delight, really. I think some places it works even better. People are more urgent for these ideas in some societies, or have a more poetic, lyrical take on what it's all about anyway, and therefore are more than comfortable with, you know, the kind of approaches we take. So, you know, maybe it was natural to think, will it travel? But, you know, our experience has been, well, yours has too, it travels. It's the same issues. It travels very well.
Yes. And we certainly have travelled, especially with the Creating Circular Friends work and person-centered planning. Serbia, Bosnia, Georgia.
We've lost some of those audiences, haven't we?
Prague. I mean, we did a lot in Eastern Europe, didn't we, for a while there, because it was something they could do and it didn't cost much money. And I think that was part of the appeal, but also very powerful and effective as an approach to inclusion.
No, I did that session in Athens once, and at the end, somebody said they just want to party now. I thought, well, we never get. We've had some English audiences that have enjoyed it, but nobody's ever said they just want to party now. I mean, it was a very much bigger response, wasn't it? But if this was them sort of experiencing a presentation or training that wasn't in the typical academic mode, then maybe it was refreshing.
I mean, Derek's fond of ending a training session with a profound quote. And of course, there was the time in Prague when Derek's profound quote left the translator falling into his arms in emotion.
Yes,
Floods of tears. She was so taken.
that's true.
She's completely collapsed. Marvelous.
Remember what it was?
I do. There was that Harriet Tubman quote. Our advice to people setting out on the Underground Railroad. You know, if you're afraid, keep going. If you're hungry, keep going. If you're tired, keep going. If you want to taste freedom, keep going. But she couldn't get to the end of translating that before she was leaving up the ship around. But I mean, maybe that is a much more powerful thing than we even realised in the Czech Republic.
Yeah.
You know, somebody of her age and generation had been in a very repressive regime, hadn't she? And I was speaking to her in a way that it doesn't speak to an English audience in the same way. Yeah. I'm guessing.
Wow. Okay.
There's a piece there, isn't there, about I noticed you using quotes from Love in the Time of Cholera on Friday, that a kind of unapologetic use of poetry or something that's more lyrical as a way of capturing a complex idea. But we've done that from the start, haven't we?
Always embraced the full range of the arts, really.
Yeah.
There's live music playing as often as we get live music.
Of course, yeah.
Drama, of course, has been all over it. The graphic has been the kind of the arts piece. Poetry. As often as we get poetry or literary.
Music's important too, isn't it?
Music as well. I mean, these are the arts, aren't they? As much arts as it's been psychology in many ways.
Yeah. And
ask you another question. Like you said, you started off in this educational psychology world, which sounds a very different place to where you are now and the work that you're doing now. So how did you start off and what happened? I know you mentioned the Isle of Wight and the ferry. So just tell us the story of like the birth of Inclusive Solutions.
Well, that Isle of Wight ferry, we were either going or coming back from a training day about how do you do circular friends work in a mainstream school. So it was an EdPsych method training day, if you like. You know, here's how you recruit a peer group. Here's the steps. You know, here's a model for the first meeting of the circle, whatever. But you know, underneath that approach was a much more profound change in what we were trying to do here. It was about saying that a lot of the ways forward and the answers lie with other young people, and it was our job to mobilize them rather than to impose specialist solutions on them. I guess that's where the split, the crack started to happen. Although the Circle of Friends work sat squarely in EdPsych approaches, running underneath it was something of a much deeper shift in what's this job all about anyway. And maybe that's why partly why we broke away.
It's interesting to think actually how Derek and I were drawn to each other as well to kind of do this kind of work. I mean, and we've been jobbing educational psychologists for plenty of years, haven't we? Before any of this started, and we were in the same team. We were working in some pretty tough areas of Nottingham City, and forever looking for kind of creative ways into work, really, weren't we? With schools and with families. Pretty harsh environments where there was a big pressure to exclude children, and there was families up against it, and neither of us we were completely anti the whole kind of psychometric traditions that have kind of so dominated our profession. And we both of us instinctively, or intellectually as well, also refused the importance of special education placements, as we were working together at that time. And I think the influence of Inclusion Press and Jack and Marcia kind of with their kind of fresh kind of Canadian, North American take on it, so you can get this down almost much simpler, was kind of so refreshing to us. We both kind of caught it. And I think, but it was, it was the right time maybe for us both. Both of us kind of, as I say, kind of forever kind of on the cusp of wanting something fresh and new to kind of move the field on, really. Because the profession has needed to move on. Still does in many ways, and, doesn't it really? So, but really getting excited about the possibility of this. And
sometimes for a cheap joke at training, we describe ourselves as recovering educational psychologists, And it usually gets an immediate laugh because people think they kind of know what you mean. But I mean, equally, some people have been a bit offended by that description over the years, that as if it's demeaning people in some way that are EPs. And I kind of stick by it. I think there's a lot you have to get over if you've been fully immersed in that world, and psychometrics and labeling people and all that stuff are at the bedrock of it. And you know, quite hard to leave that behind, the measuring people piece. And what do you do if you don't do that, which is still a big issue. I mean, we referred a lot on Friday to that documentary that went out on Thursday night called Subnormal, didn't we? Which was about the... Did you see that, Elliot?
No.
No. It was taken out. It was...
Steve McQueen.
Yeah, Steve McQueen did one of his films was about education. This was a documentary, I think partly produced by him, that was about the assessment and removal of Caribbean children into special schools in the 70s and 80s. Oh. And people whose lives had been
blighted
by that. And quite a few in the group on Friday had watched it, and you know, it was given them pause to think, but that used to be mainstream work. You assess people, their IQ was below 70, therefore you go to what was called a subnormal school, or educationally subnormal school, became moderate learning difficulties school, good heavens. And, you know, most people see that now as wrong.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I remember when my first year of being an educational psychologist, the woman I was sharing an office with said, yeah, she said it used to be just like moving boxes. She said you'd move 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, and basically you were assessing the box. Does it need to stay, or does it need to go to special education? And psychometrics is what you were assessing the box with. Some got moved, some stayed, and that was it. 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, go home, have a lunch in the middle. Yes.
Job done.
There has to be a better way.
So you just saw that there's a massive need for change. So you went out on your own and started a company, basically.
Yes.
And here we are, years later.
Exactly.
And yeah, sounds like it's going really well, to providing lots of training for lots of different types of people. So you mentioned a few names there. You know, Marsha Forrest, Jack Pierpoint. Who are these people, and you know, who are the people that inspire you, or that inspire you now? Is there any new people that inspire you now?
Big question.
Big question.
Big question. Well, so Jack Pierpoint and Marsha Forrest were kind of sort of leading lights of this setup called Inclusion Press, and coming out of Toronto, although Marsha was actually from New York, and a very powerful kind of educator, and Jackie got kind of beat the streets kind of prison reform kind of background, and a big kind of sort of community organizer. They were kind of together with John O'Brien. They'd created these person-centered planning tools like Path and Maps and solution circles, and also the Circle of Friends approach. And so we were interested in their work from way back, and it was so fresh, and we were able to just try their ideas out over in the UK and get them over big conferences. So we actually got to meet them and work with them face to face. You found those old VHS videos, didn't you, Derek, from way back?
Right, yeah, the early,
amazing, really.
Work on circles in schools.
Kind of the early YouTube stuff. This was really, but you said that was going on. But you know, that wasn't to say there weren't kind of UK influences on our thinking and work. I mean, Tony Descent had been a massive kind of reformer in education, and we were lucky to have him as our principal psychologist for a while. Then he launched on a big move to kind of make Nottinghamshire much more inclusive, and there was closures of special schools. There was a whole radical change around resourcing of children in mainstream schools. I mean, he was a massive influence along with his writing. And there's
a woman called Gerda Hanko, who was in her late 70s, 80s when we first met her, and was of the old psychoanalytic school of understanding behavior in different ways. But she had a gift of making those quite abstruse kind of terminologies much more accessible, and she was passionate about leading groups and facilitating groups in problem solving. So from Gerda's work and how she tried to do things in plain language, and You know, never used complex ideas like transference, but still talked about them. I think I'd count her as a big influence early on. And when we got into the Circle of Adults work and those kinds of things, that was about us consciously saying, bringing a group together to think together in a facilitated way was a good way forward for a staff team when they're dealing with challenging behaviour. And what the outside expert facilitator was doing was getting the best out of the group, rather than tell them what was wrong and here's what you do about it. So the Circle of Adults work was in the same place, because it was facilitation, getting the best out of people. The answers are here if we can find them together, not sitting on some expert's desk. So yeah, that was a big source, but quite unrelated. I mean, Gerda Hanko and Marcia Forrest, Jack Pierpoint would be very far apart intellectually, wouldn't they? And come from very different places, but similar instincts. I think some parents continue to be quite inspiring, don't they? And the parents we've met who've had kind of the bravery to go up against the system and find a way through that works for their child, if not for the system, or send us their stories. I think been quite important people to us, haven't they?
Absolutely. So people like Caroline McKeith and the Dr. Marisa McKeith, as well as the sort of the whole the Alliance for Inclusive Education in the UK. Tara Floods, Richard Rees, Michelin Mason, they're very strong leaders within the UK, making things happen that weren't really replicated in other countries at all. That leadership by disabled people, very powerful, very thoughtful and change makers. But the parent, as Derek says, lots of parents have not only influenced us, but have kind of influenced law, made all sorts of things happen.
That may be one of our kind of unique bits, really, that we've always had strong links with people that would call themselves disability activists, haven't we?
That's true.
And in a way that's just not typical of our previous profession or many in education, that they have very little dialogue with people that would call themselves disability activists. And I don't think that happens very much,
That's true.
But they've been a continuing source of, well, if that idea doesn't work with them, then we're probably not going to use it, kind of thinking, isn't it? I've always been quite proud or pleased with the fact that somebody like Tara Flood, who's a disability activist, could be part of our Keys to Inclusion Day and value it, and not feel she wanted to be part of that. She could support everything we're trying to say. That's quite an important badge to wear, I think, for us, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. But books have always been important. Look behind Derek's head. Look at all those books. There's been a lot of reading. So if you could sum all those names up, that's a lot of names, isn't it? It's a lot of.
Yeah, I know.
A lot of reading influence. Too many to name.
I know.
Thank you for that. I love what you said there about if this idea doesn't sit right with these people, then we won't use it. That's a really good way to think about it, and it's important of having like allies on your team.
It's so true. We just wouldn't do it, would we? If somebody like Tara or Michelin or somebody said to us, "Well, that's crap,"
don't say that. We wouldn't.
We'd quickly remember why.
That sounds like good allyship. You know what I mean? It means you guys are responsive and you're thinking about, the people that you're trying to advocate for, really. The other thing I wanted to ask you about is, over these 20 years, this long time, what are the biggest achievements you've been most proud of? Is there anything that stands out?
Oh, well, that's a question. That's a good question again. I mean, I'm very proud of the books that we've co-written.
I think so.
They'll stand the test of time. That the Creating Circle of Friends book, I think we must sell a couple of copies of that every week. That's our biggest seller. But the other books, the Keys to Inclusion, the Circle of Adults, the Research Solutions, they'll be good. And they're well received. So that's important. That'd be my first one.
I think also, I mean, we do what people would just describe as still bits of casework in that horrible phrase, but getting to know and having conversations with people who are parents of disabled children and young people, and helping them think of other ways around their situation, or other ways of describing what their child brings, especially with the idea of a focus on contribution, or when's this person at their best. And I think I'm quite proud of the fact that I've always got an alternative script, but the conversation you might have with me versus a more traditional ologist would be very different. And being conscious to put that together in a way that, I can now talk about things in a practical way that have really got very little to do with a medical model version of difference. And that's taken work, I think. I mean, we can both do that. I mean, I still like working with parents. You do.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so it motivates me still. I'd like to see people thinking, well, there's other ways of seeing this story.
And the nice and linked to this, of course, we've created person-centered practice, actual real practice with real young people and their families. And, we've been able to bring that right into the heart of our training. So when we do training days on, say, person-centered planning, or creating stuff for the friends, we have real situations where we've done the kind of moldy sleeves up work on it and demonstrated it. We're not talking about what somebody else has done. It's generally what we've done ourselves. So again, that's we can be proud of that, I think, as well. We talk about we're walking the talk as well as just talking about it.
It's a key bit of our training impact, that, isn't it? That we can say, here's a family we were working with 3 months ago.
Yeah.
Here's what happened. Here's what felt difficult, and here's how we got around it, or whatever it might be. It's clear we're doing it. I guess that matters in training.
Yeah.
People actually see, well, he is down on his hands and knees doing this, or he's getting his hands dirty with pastels and pens doing this.
And our training, the rack of training we offer, I would super be proud of that, really. The quality there and the engagement. When we get people in front of us, 99%, the ratings, the feedback, the engagement, all of it is so high. We kind of know confidently we have created something rich here, really. Even difficult areas, even when we're giving messages people don't actually want to hear, they'd probably quite like us to say, send some children to specials, keep some in mainstream. We're not saying that. We're saying this is about including all the children, all the young people. So it's an uncomfortable message, really. But we found a way of doing it in such a rich way. People still leave smiling, feeling like they've got a lot out of it, which I think is, worth waving a flag about, really. So we've got a good rack of training. And more recently, we've been able to put it online as well. That Inclusive Solutions School, to actually have some self-paced learning, was a kind of that was a lockdown achievement, really. I certainly feel proud of that one. That took a bit of doing. But I think also our person-centered planning events, don't you, Derek? I think some of the teams we've brought together over the years that were in a bad, messed up place, confused, not really pointing in the right direction, that ended up pointing in the same direction with a coherent plan, a clear vision, really, really motivated to kind of move on.
We almost didn't have to be in the room anymore, did we?
No.
Which is a great end to facilitation, isn't it? They've almost forgotten you there. They've taken it back, or it's about the team now. And oh yeah, we're about to say bye to you, but your work here is done.
And often it was. Often they never get us back because the job was done. They knew where they were going, off they went. That's probably a great sign, really. It's something to be pleased about. The bottom line on it is on the handful of children who aren't in special school now, that might have been had we not done this work. They're the ones I mean personally, and I'm sure Derek feels, and they're the ones you take to your grave, really. Yeah. The ones we've somehow managed to steer the system, the staff's attitude away, so that never happened. And almost uncountable to know how many that is, really. It could be many, for all we know.
That's probably the thing that keeps you going, doesn't it? That's the reason you're doing it.
Absolutely, every time.
So what I would like to ask is, it's about the inclusion movement in general itself. You guys are basically activists at this point, and so you've come far away from this sort of educational psychologist role, and now you're in this inclusion movement activist role. What are the biggest challenges that the inclusion movement faces right now?
Well, massive increases in number in special education, the existence and the filling up of alternative provision, the fact that fixed term and permanent exclusions have gone, right through the ceiling in the last few years, the overrepresentation of black, brown, and other cultures of children and young people in special education and alternative provision. Yeah, we were making a lot of progress, and then there seems to be a kind of a bit of a dip back now. We seem to be facing a kind of a pullback, and that's almost a reactionary pullback. And I think that's been fed and not helped by kind of right-wing education policies in the increased academization, the increasing privatization of the education system, the kind of spotlight on results for mainstream schools, without much generosity to the more inclusive schools, despite the fact that can have an impact on their the academic results they have to report, the kind of competitive pressure and spotlight again on that. All these forces have not made that job easy at all, really. And relationships have been put to the bottom of the list, really, and academic in its narrowest form of achievement and results have been pushed up high. And that's a massive challenge, and it still is.
Mm.
Oh, it's a huge question, isn't it? And I mean, still in my heart, I don't think anybody believes inclusion's a bad thing, to put it bluntly. When I often say at the start of a training, no head teacher ever stands up in front of a parents' evening and says we're not an inclusive school. They all want to be known by that badge, but it doesn't mean their actual practice very effectively reflects that. And I think that's true. I mean, most of what governments and all the rest of it flag up is their commitment to increase inclusion, where quite clearly the river's flowing in the other way in some cases. But I don't think anybody ever saw a beautiful example of inclusion, or like a kid well included in a class and say, well, I don't like that. You know in your heart this is the right thing, but there's so much gets in the way. I think sometimes there's a bit too much happy talk in the inclusion. There's almost a bit too much agreement, and not enough hard talk in some ways. When Tara was on to us a while back about how can she reconcile the strongly held views of deaf culture versus the disability activist social model, and when deaf culture have been saying we won't be told not to be separate, we won't be told by hearing people to be in mainstream schools, we want our own special. There's still a hard piece in the inclusion movement that isn't resolved yet. Strong voices. The whole idea of taking away any kind of assessment of somebody or comparing them against normal is a big challenge issue that isn't much talked about. People kind of nod and say, well, yeah, absolutely, we mustn't be doing that. And then they go and do it. And they might call it national curriculum levels or whatever, but it's still basically, like we almost began this recording with saying some of the hard conversations aren't happening often enough. And maybe some of the hard conversations around inclusion aren't happening often enough. When we happily say all means all, but we don't know exactly what that would look like, well, perhaps that needs some more teeth sometimes. At the end of high schools as we know it, and I would say who would care, but
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, all this business around the education healthcare plan, it's so medical model, it's so focused on what is wrong with the child. Fantastic opportunity a few years ago to do something more dramatic, and what they ended up doing, the legislators, was just a little icy topping called person-centered planning or person-centered thinking, and then the rest of us full-on medical model. What's wrong? Tell us all about what the child finds difficult and what provisions needed to meet that need and where that's going to happen. So it's and that's completely run amok now. That so local authorities, people who could make a difference to inclusion, are now just completely bogged down in generating the education healthcare plans and psychological advice to go with it, and it's sad waste of resources and time and energy, and not really feeding inclusion. Big distraction.
So it sounds like the educational psychology like field isn't really at the moment doing what it's supposed to do, or in terms of inclusion anyway. It's not really a very inclusive system, and people
Well,
are
it
being.
says it wants to be. Although it says it wants to be.
Yeah.
I mean, every psychology service has got inclusion as its top driver. Doesn't mean their practice actually supports that. That's one of the hard conversations, I think. Yeah.
We're extremely powerful profession.
Yeah.
And we have a massive impact on inclusion or not inclusion, just on the basis of our advice. So potentially educational psychologists, like it or not, have been part of the problem, have been part of the challenge. They haven't all been part of the solution. They haven't all been fully on board with let's get inclusive here and drive through all the kind of all the heat that would perhaps mean would then follow. So there's a challenge there for the profession still.
Let me ask one final question then. So what if you could give some advice to a young person who wants to get involved in educational psychology and wants to do it right and make a difference? What would your advice be?
Well, I would immerse yourself, learn all the lovely inclusion processes that we've spoken about, we've touched on already, I guess, in this interview. Really immerse yourself in what person-centered planning means, person-centered thinking really means, the values around focusing on gifts and capacity and contribution and generosity, and what the young person literally brings to the world, rather than what's wrong with them and what's broken them. Do anything you can to resist that voice and that force and that other set of ideas that says what you're all about as a psychologist is looking at what's wrong with them and what we need to do to fix them. Really, really work on resisting that. Embrace that person-centered mindset and methodology, and also get hold of problem-solving processes like Circle of Adults, solution circles, insight solution circles. Get good at them, know when to use them. And learn as much as you can about involving the peer group and activating and mobilizing the child's peer group. So that's circle of friends, that's peer mediation, that's all the things that engage the other young people. I think also anything you can do to kind of get powerful around thinking and working systemically with whole schools. So that might be training, but it might be working with the head teacher confidently to bring massive changes around the whole school. So really remembering this is political, this is whole school system. This is not just about one individual child here. So constantly keep making that link back to the bigger system. Yeah, that'd be my first shot.
Yeah, I think if I was re-entering the profession for some reason, God help me, those are the sort of things I'd reach out for and cling on to. The paradox is that you're almost only invited in there because you are the so-called expert with the diagnosis up his sleeve. And it's finding a space where they want you there, but not for that. I think also wherever you work, you're going to find people who get it and people who don't. And somehow nurturing like hell the people who get it, because they are your sponsors in a way. Schools are very competitive with each other, and if they start sensing that there's some school making a very different kind of use of you as a psychologist than another one does, then they'll pay more attention to that than you telling them. So I think your allies are vital, and your allies in the schools are vital. I think they're all there. There are plenty of SENCOs who've had more than enough of labels and all that medical stuff, but need help to go in other directions. So find your allies and nurture the hell out of them.
and learn your stories, hear the stories, remember the story, tell the story.
Yeah.
I mean, between us, we've got so many great stories of inclusion now, true stories, real stories that really bring out just how powerful it is and why it is so important to be included in our world. And it's stories, it's the narrative, isn't it? It's the changing narrative that we need, really, looking forward, looking beyond to the obstacles of the now, way into the future there. A fresher, more inclusive narrative where diversity, fluidity in all the areas is kind of embraced and welcomed. And we have a different world, not just in the UK, but worldwide. This is big stuff we're talking here, isn't it?
Amazing.